So we go from the book as a concept to the book as itself. Here, I have a new series called Page Break, and I've really read Doreen's text so many times that I have it like memorized. And she writes that the violence of extraction haunts Page Break, and I often quote you on that. And this is actually my book that you buy on Amazon, my book that took me 8 years to publish and write. And yes, it's a thin, flimsy, inexpensive paperback volume that you can buy online on the internet. Um, but for me, it holds a, incalculable value. And I wanted to sort of represent the book as that beloved object by framing it, but not by framing an improved version of it, but by framing the very average version of it. And so what Page Breaks does is that I actually slice the page from the book here as echograph, and then I frame the page beside the book that once housed it. And it represents the efforts that I think are communal, and I include NEWFORUM and thank you Salimi and Madeline for inviting us. It's a communal effort to take poetry beyond the page and allow poets to think of new ways that they might present their work to the world. Um, so it's really just a framed paperback volume, but then that just is quite ironic because again, every book that is published not only takes years usually to write, but then the act of actually getting it published, for anyone who's ever published a book can confirm it is gruesome. And so it's really disheartening as a writer when you realize that, your book that you finally got published will will really not have much of a life on a shelf unless you take matters into your own hands, which is what we're doing here.
Yes, and it's also not just framed, like I think when we have now talked to the framer, I think it really becomes an object. It really becomes an art piece because it's of course, on one hand you have just the pages, but how it's made in the end and how you can hang it now on the wall. We see it also behind Anna. Um, it's really special and it has very, how to say, fine and very delicate art to do it and how you decide to do it. And I think this is really special and people feel this immediately when they see it because it's not just a book behind the glass, it really comes alive because it has its space, it has its own space in the frame. And I think this is the miracle behind it.
And there's also something playful to it, of being like, well, now it's framed. Now you have to see it in a whole different way. And it seems like it might feel very subtle or even, something that's reasonable in the context of the exhibition, in the context of the body of work that Anna has. But I also thought about it a little bit as like a playful way of, yes, on one hand, elevating poetry to something else. Not that it needs to be elevated in my perspective, but it is also a very simple way of opening up to questions in regards as to how, by framing, in this case, this single page and then the book by right next to it, how this diptych becomes something other than just the book or just the poem. And why we feel that way when we're confronted with such a thing, right? And again, I think that it's a very clever way of making that distinction, of breaking that relation to it. And especially when we think about other contemporary art practices that rely very much in this kind of collection of words from different places, right? And we see that popping up a lot during the 60s and 70s, where the actual output is very much like this, although it doesn't necessarily come from the same source, right? It doesn't necessarily come from something that the artists have written themselves, but rather something that they found and put together and assembled in a different way, sorry. So I think that here, I don't know, that's the reason why it feels so playful. Yeah.
Maybe this is a good time to open up to questions. I think that you brought up a really great point that, does poetry need to be elevated? Is such a it's a huge can of worms. And what does elevated mean, right? And also, do we need to frame things to value them? I think is a question that I read into what you were saying into your language, and my reading is that question. Like, do we need to frame things to value them, or can we value them if no one tells us that they are valuable? Like if there's no artist, if there's no gallery, if there's no curator saying this is valuable, are we able to value them on our own?
And I think the thing about our current financial system is